Okay, so I think I've covered pretty well the intro. I mean, I do want to, before we get into the actual reading of the Gospels, I do want to cover kind of more broadly, instead of, we'll get to the rest of the New Testament later. I talked about some of that in the previous video. But for now, let's just focus on the four Gospels themselves and kind of explain how we're going to do this and why. Okay, so I want to do this. I want to read through the Gospels twice. I am going to read them in chronological sequencing, but before I do that, I'm going to read them Gospel by Gospel. So we're going to start with the Gospel of Mark. Now, my reason for doing that, I think, and as I said in the previous video, in addition to the New Testament itself, we have lots of written materials left behind by Christians of this era or just slightly after about the New Testament and about the Apostles' teaching and about Jesus. These are not part of the New Testament canon, but there's a lot of material left behind by other Christians of the generation right after the Apostles or just afterwards, in which we can get a great deal of insight about the New Testament time period itself. As a general rule, I am going to put more value in what those ancient Christians just after the New Testament time period say than what some 18th and 19th century German atheist scholar says. Okay, today it's very much in vogue to take the post-Enlightenment atheistic critical attitude and say, well, they know what they're talking about. These atheist German scholars of the 18 and 1900s, they know what they're talking about. These, clueless Hebrew-speaking rubes of the 1st and 2nd century AD, they didn't know anything. Okay, I'm going to put more value in what the ancient writers said, who were living either during the times themselves or just after, and knew people who did live during their times. Okay, I believe their testimony is considerably more reliable. I think there is some value in studying the text, what we call textual criticism. Okay, and we're going to see that when we read the Gospels in chronological order, and we're going to compare those parallel passages to each other and try to figure out what the differences are and what those differences tell us about the individual writers and what their different focuses were. But I'm going to put more value in the ancient testimony because they know more what we're talking about. And we have lots of that. There's plenty, in addition to the New Testament itself, there's plenty of other documents going around about the New Testament from people who are either living at the very end of that time period or just afterwards. And there's very consistent unanimous agreement that the Gospels were written by the people whose names are attached to them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, even though all four of them are anonymous. And of course, the same guy who wrote Luke also wrote Acts. So if the guy named Luke wrote Luke, he also wrote Acts. The author doesn't identify himself by name in either example, but he's clearly the same person. And Acts is a sequel to Luke. So there really isn't any dispute about that. There's not really any solid reason to doubt that. The ancient testimony is unanimous in establishing Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the authors of those four apostles, of the four Gospels. Now, Matthew and John were part of Jesus' group of 12. Okay, and so they were eyewitnesses to the events contained therein that they talk about. John in particular will emphasize this in his Gospel, as well as in his epistles. Matthew, not quite so much, but he was a little bit farther. I mean, he was one of the 12, but John was one of the inner three. John and Peter, a good chunk of the New Testament comes from the testimonies of Peter and John, and they were two of the inner three. Jesus had his circle of 12, but of that 12, he had the inner circle of 3, Peter, James, and John. James and John were brothers. James, that particular James, died too soon to write anything down himself. So the letter that has the name James in it was not written by that guy named James. It was written by a different guy named James. So of those 3 innermost circles, one of them dies too soon to write anything down. The other 2, however, are responsible for quite a bit of the written material of the New Testament. Peter writes 2 epistles. John writes 3 epistles. John also has the revelation given to him. and John writes a gospel. And Peter, although he doesn't write a gospel himself directly, leaves his teachings with a guy named Mark, who does write a gospel based on what he learned from Peter. And Mark may also have, that's where Mark is from, and Mark may also have been present for some of the events, because in addition to those 12 with the apostles, he had his inner circle of 3, and he had the wider circle of 12. Then beyond that, he also had a wider circle of people who came around and followed him around, at least part of the time. We read in all 4 Gospels about these women who followed him around. And we also read in Luke about a group of 70 disciples he sent out at a later point in time, in addition to the 12. So there were, and we read also about crowds just kind of following him around in general. So there were people following him around besides just these 12. And Mark may have been a member of that extended group, at least part of the time. There is a very strong chance that Mark is referring to himself when he refers to the young man who fled naked from the Garden of Gethsemane after Jesus' arrest in Mark 15, or 14, excuse me. It's very, very likely he's referring to himself. If that's the case, there's a strong tradition, a strong reason to believe that the Last Supper of Jesus may have been held in Mark's house. In which case, Jesus would have been intimately familiar with Mark's family. So Mark, even though he was a young man at the time, and probably was not with Jesus all the time, maybe even most of the time, may have been present for some of the events himself, and even if he wasn't, he got his teachings from Peter. And you can tell in the Gospel of Mark that Peter takes a predominant stage in general. He was the leader of that group of 12 men. I mean, that's clear. He was probably the oldest of the 12. He was definitely the most outspoken and dynamic. So he was the leader. So he just takes preeminence. He just kind of takes a state of prominence in general. But in particular, in the Gospel of Mark, there are telltale signs that this testimony is coming straight from Peter. So of the 4 Gospels, 2 of them are written by full-blown disciples, apostles of Christ. One of them was written by a disciple who got his testimony from an apostle of Christ and may have been present for some of the events himself. One of them was written by Luke, who was not an apostle of Christ, and does not claim to be. Openly admits that he was not, and that he got his information after careful research from people who were. Okay, I think when you read the Gospel of Luke, you'll find a lot of information in it that isn't in the other Gospels, and it seems very, very, very likely that Luke found these people and interviewed them like a historian or a reporter would, and compiled his gospel based on the testimony he heard from the people who spoke it to him. I think we can read in the book of Acts, an excellent time period. In case he wrote Acts, the guy who wrote Luke also wrote Acts, an excellent time period in which he would have done this. There was a period of time, Luke accompanied Paul around a lot. In the book of Acts, second half of the book of Acts, we start reading about these we sections, where apparently the author of the book is traveling around with Paul. And that goes all the way into the end of the book, including when Paul goes back to Jerusalem and gets arrested at the end of the book of Acts. Luke presumably was there, and Paul spent 2 years in prison in the area of Judea, in a town called Caesarea by the sea. And presumably Luke was there. Presumably Luke was not in prison himself, but he was apparently with Paul. And I think it's very, 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 very likely that it was during that time period, those 2 years, while Paul was in prison, waiting for something to happen, that Luke, who was with him but was not in prison himself, went around talking to people in that area who were still living in that area, who remembered Jesus, who were still alive, who still had their own memories and testimony of what they experienced during those days. And then he compiled that into his gospel, which he wrote, and then later on wrote the book of Acts, partially based on his own experiences, because he was present for some of those. So I think we can easily date the book of Luke to being sometime in the late 50s, when Paul's in prison in Caesarea awaiting his trial, which eventually will happen in Rome. And Luke is there with him with nothing else to do. I think we can very easily, very, very comfortably assume that it was during that time when Luke investigated the stories about Jesus and put his gospel in writing. And I believe Luke also used the gospels of Matthew and Mark as part of that, which would have already existed at that time. In fact, Luke even begins his gospel by saying, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled before us, or among us. So he's acknowledging that there were other written accounts circulating at that point in time. He says the word many. In the English, is the word used is many. Now again, I don't know exactly what that Greek word means, but when I see the English word many, I'm thinking more than two. So even though I believe Luke is including the Gospels of Matthew and Mark in that many, I think he's probably also referring to other things besides that too. And we do have other, I said before, we have lots of other New Testament adjacent documents that existed from around this time period that we still have access to, including other Gospels. Including there are, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Barnabas, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, and there are a lot, the Gospel to the Hebrews, the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. There are lots of different types of Gospels that we even have today. And if we still had several of them today, think about how many more there may have been at that point in time that didn't survive in any form. There are still several other Gospels that survive to this day that probably have some basis in the life of Jesus, and that were either corrupted or were used by, corrupt influences or whatever. Were not accepted within the church as being legitimate or authoritative. And then we have several of those available to us even to this day. And if we still have several available today, then, they would have had even more circulating at that time that didn't survive 1900 plus years. So we know that other people were trying to write down the events of Jesus' life and the teachings of Jesus. So when Luke says many, I believe he's including Matthew and Mark in that many, and I also think he's referring to others as well. Many. Now, you'll see a lot of people today say that Mark was the first to write down the events of Jesus' life, and that probably is true. The ancient testimony, however, indicates that Matthew was the first, and that he wrote originally in the native language of the Jews in Hebrew. Now, we don't have a legitimate surviving Christian copy of the Hebrew Matthew. We do have Hebrew Matthews, but they're generally not taken to be like a Christian copy of Matthew. I think it's actually probably true to say that both Matthew and Mark were the first to write about Jesus. Of the four Gospels that we have, I think it's accurate to say, in a certain manner of speaking, that both Matthew and Mark were the first. I believe that Mark was the first to write down the events of Jesus' life. I think as you read the Gospels, you can see that, and that both Matthew and Luke use Mark's narrative framework as the skeleton for their own Gospels. Matthew in particular does this. Mark has the most emphasis on Jesus' actions. He does not have very much emphasis on Jesus' teaching. He calls Jesus a teacher a lot. But he doesn't have very many examples of his actual teaching in the Gospel. He's much more focused on actions, on verbs, on doing, on showing Jesus' authority by his actions. And that probably is what spoke to Peter. Okay, Mark would have gotten his information from Peter, largely. And Peter probably was drawn to that. Peter seems to have been a very, action-oriented fellow, someone who probably responded well to a man of action. Some people are that way. I'm not really that way. I'm not a man of action, and I don't particularly respond to men of action. Like I'm not likely to leap into battle and motivated and inspired by a man of action. Like I don't have that kind of temperament or personality. I mean, look at me. Matthew was more inspired by Jesus' teachings. And so I think it's accurate to say, as the ancient writers did say, that Matthew was the first to write down Jesus' teachings, because Mark doesn't focus on Jesus' teachings very much. Matthew, I think, was the first to include, to make an attempt to write down Jesus' teachings. He probably did it originally in the language of the Hebrews, because that was their native tongue at that point in time. And that might have happened very early. Matthew may have begun doing that very early, possibly even before they left Jerusalem. Now, I don't think that lasted. I don't think whatever Hebrew copy of Matthew he legitimately wrote existed, either was corrupted, taken and corrupted by other groups, or doesn't exist anymore. But I believe a lot of our puzzlement about where the Gospels came from and how they relate to each other can be solved by assuming the existence of an original version of Matthew, which is not the one we have now, but a kind of a proto-Matthew, a Hebrew version of Matthew that Matthew was working on and writing and compiling the teachings of Jesus strictly for Jewish Christians living in Jerusalem when the church first got started. And then later on, at some point after that, he essentially, I believe, rewrote his gospel. I don't think it's a translation. And one of the reasons why this theory gets dismissed by the smart people is because they look at the Greek copies of Matthew that we have now, and it doesn't appear to be a translation. Well, I'm not saying it is a translation. I'm saying he just rewrote his gospel, starting from the ground up, starting from scratch in Greek, after having already written a photo version of it in Hebrew. I want to show you something. Give me just a second here. I gotta get something that I have over here. This might seem to be a strange comparison, or a strange way of demonstrating this point, but bear with me. I have in my hands here a physical copy of a Nintendo Switch video game called Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Collection. Or at the top it says F. It might be hard to say, but it might be hard to see. At the top there it says FF Pixel Remaster. And then down there it says Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Collection. And you have little images of the main characters of those 6 games, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Lined up in a row. Okay, and here's the cartridge itself. This game, actually it's a collection of games, there's 6 of them. I got this on the Nintendo Switch as a collection, as you can see here, earlier this year, around June. And it is, as its name implies, a collection of the first 6 Final Fantasy games that we're, called the Pixel Remaster. So the graphics are redone, the sound is redone. Now, a little bit of history here. I don't want to get too lost in the weeds, because this is just here to supplement my point. But the first 6 Final Fantasy games came out in the 1980s and 1990s on the Nintendo and Super Nintendo video game systems. The first 3 games came out on the Nintendo, or the Famicom system as it was called in Japan, because these are actually Japanese games. And the second 3, 4, 5, and 6 came out on the Super Nintendo in the 1990s. Okay, so in the years since then, these games, especially the first 2 of them, have been re-released several times. Okay, this copy that I've got right here is not by any means, this is 2023, okay. This copy I got right here is not by any means the first time these games have been released since their original release in the 1980s, 1990s. Stop that right now. Okay, especially the first 2. The first 2 have been released like 8 times. Okay, the first 2 games in particular have been re-released. They were re-released in 1999 on a handheld platform that only came out in Japan. They were re-released in 2003 on the PlayStation 1, a video game system that was released here. They were re-released in 2007. They were re-released, actually 2005, excuse me, in another gaming system. They were re-released in 2007. They were re-released on phones. They were re-released here. I may be even missing 1 or 2 along the way. Okay. The first 2 games of this collection of 6 in particular have at least 7 versions of them that have existed over the course of time. The others not so much, but they've all been re-released multiple times. So this is not by any means the first time these. The first one of these games came out in 1987, and the 6th one came out in 1994. So they basically came out once a year, basically for 6 or 7 years, and they've been re-released many times ever since. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because when I played these games last summer, I played the first 3 of them last summer. I was intrigued. I wanted to know how much, if any, of their original code. If you know anything about video games, you know that at the end of the day, they're basically just a bunch of lines of code with graphical assets and musical assets I don't know how they do it. I mean, but someone has to code this stuff. In order, you program the graphics, you program the music, but you have to make it all run together, you have to have programming code in there. So when I played these games last summer, I was curious how much of the, if any, of the original code from the original version of the games were still in there. Like how much of the underlying NES code is still in this version of Final Fantasy I, for example. The very first one, Final Fantasy I, 1987, over 30 years ago now. How much of that? Now this itself, by the way, these versions of the games, these are these pixel remasters. This is not even new. Okay, I just got this last year because they just finally came out on the Switch in cartridge form last year. But these were actually done on the computer a couple of years ago. They were released. Now I have them all here in one collection, but they were released one by one by one by one by one by one every couple of months back in like 2021. So they're not even new. All right, this version of the game itself is a port of an existing version of the game. So I was curious, like how much of the original NES code was underlying these games. And it turns out none of it is. Okay, these games are running on an entirely new coding framework. None of the original. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how far back in time you have to go. Like I said, FF1 and 2 in particular have been released like 7 or 8 times over the years. And I don't know were they rewritten from the ground up every time. I mean, as a player playing the game, I can't see the code. Okay. Now there are hacking tools out there that allow people to look into the code. Like I don't have access to that. When I play the game, I play the finish. I don't see the code at all. Okay. I don't know how far back, of all those multiple re-releases of the games that have been done over the last 30 years, I don't know how far back you have to go before you start losing the original NES code. Maybe they rewrote it every time. I don't know. I doubt it. I really do. But I don't know. But I do know that these versions of the game are completely new. Like they were rewritten from the ground up. There's not a shred of the original NES code underlying those games. Or SNES code, Super Nintendo. They were faithful recreations of the original games, but they themselves are like totally new version of the games. They have no underlying tissue connecting them to the original products. I view the Gospel of Matthew as we have it today to be basically the same. I think the Gospel of Matthew today is a totally new version of what Matthew of a project that Matthew originally started sometime beforehand, before he wrote the one that we have now. That would have been in Hebrew, would have been basically just a teaching. And we've seen this already. We read a lot in the Old Testament, these teachings, okay? Like the Old Testament itself is more concerned about the teachings and about the narratives. When you read the Old Testament, like they arrange, at least in the Hebrew Bibles, they arrange the narrative books at the end. They put the history books at the end of the Old Testament. Now we put those kind of at the beginning. We have the law. Moses' material is kind of a mixture of law and history, because he has the law. He also has events in there, and that's at the beginning. And then you have Joshua that finishes off the story of them going to the Promised Land. And then in our Bibles, we go through the rest of the events until 2nd Chronicles, and then we get to the writings, the Psalms and the Psalms and the Proverbs and all that. And then we have the prophets. Okay, we put the prophets at the end, but in their Bibles, they put the history books at the end because to them that was the least important part. The narratives, the events, the recounting of events. Not to say that it wasn't important, it was the least important part. The teachings were more important. The teachings always trump, stories about events in the Jewish mindset. So Matthew, I think, followed that mindset, and I think when he first wrote his material, he wrote it in teaching form, as the ancient witness testifies to, Papias. And the earliest witness we have of the Gospels says this, and I believe it's accurate, that Matthew would have originally written his Gospel in Hebrew, and it was basically a collection of the teachings of Jesus And we see this even reflected in the book of Luke, because the book of Luke contains the teachings of Matthew, in particular the Sermon on the Mount, but it splits it up into parts. And the parts in Luke where he splits up the Sermon on the Mount are parts where in the Hebrew version of Matthew we see these different headings about Jesus talking to his disciples, indicating that there was a version. Now I'll go into this when we actually cover the material in depth. Indicating, however, that there was a version of Matthew where the Sermon on the Mount was not all one collection, and it was split up into chunks of sayings of Jesus. So I think it's accurate then to say that both Matthew and Mark were the first attempts at writing down Jesus, at least of these four Gospels. Because Matthew, I think, was the first to record the teachings of Jesus, whereas Mark was the first to write down the events of Jesus' life and his actions and doings. I think at some point after Mark began writing his gospel account of the narrative of Jesus, Matthew rewrote his gospel to include narrative, borrowing a lot from Mark, and interspersing those narrative accounts within the teachings. That, I think, explains a lot of why the Gospels are the way they are. Then Luke comes along later and uses both of them plus other sources to compose his account. And then John, writing even later than time than that, fully aware of the other three Gospels, gives us another take on Jesus' life entirely, and does not simply retread the material from the other three Gospels, and in fact, illuminates some things that the other three Gospels kind of kept unanswered. And so that, I think, in the end, is where a lot of, we talk about the mystery of the Synoptic Gospels. The first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels, which refers to the same eye. They have much the same material and much the same format as each other. John is very, 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 very different. And I think, to a large degree, the differences between the Gospels, the Gospels exist the way they do. We can attribute a lot of that to the fact that both Matthew and Mark, in their own way, were the first to write down about Jesus. Matthew being the first to write about his teachings, Mark the first to write about his actions, and then later on, Matthew rewrote his Gospel to combine teachings, actions with the teachings. And I believe also that Mark had several versions of his gospel too. We can see that reflected in the story of the rooster crowing when Jesus predicts Jesus that Peter will deny him before the rooster crows, and Mark says it will actually happen twice. The other gospels don't mention that second time. Then Mark has a little bit more detail that was added, probably as a direct input from Peter himself, who, of course, is the person in question here, and so would be the best person to know if their rooster crows once or twice. And you can kind of see the fingerprints of Peter's input into Mark's gospel there. But the other gospels might not have known about the second crowing at the time they composed their gospels, so they don't mention that. So that is the way. So we're going to start with the book of Mark. When we get to the gospel reading tomorrow, we're going to start with Mark, then we're going to do Matthew, then we're going to do Luke, then we're going to do John. I'm not going in order from Matthew through John because I kind of wanted to, but I think Mark would be the better place to start because it is easier to understand. Matthew is very teaching heavy, as I mentioned, and it's very Jewish in nature. Mark is Roman. Now, Mark himself is a Jew, but he's writing to Romans. Okay, Mark is not necessarily writing to lifelong Jews when he writes his gospel. He's writing to Romans. And so he's not as heavy on the Jewish customs and teachings. And when he does mention them, he explains them. And it's because of that, and because it doesn't have the teachings, and because it is more action-focused and narrative-focused, and because I believe Matthew and Luke both wrote their narratives kind of following Mark's framework of the events that he records, I want to start with Mark. Mark is the shortest, mainly because he doesn't include the teachings as much. There is far fewer examples. He talks about Jesus being a teacher, but he doesn't include very many examples of his teaching. And that's mainly the reason why his book is shorter than the others. But you also see in Matthew, Luke, and John, after that, a progression of expanding both the beginning and the ending of the story, because Mark has a very abrupt beginning, he has a very abrupt ending, and each of the Gospels after that kind of steps back a bit at the beginning and also goes forward a bit at the end, meaning that it's being built on as time goes on. Like we're going farther and farther. Mark just starts with the beginning of the ministry. Matthew then goes back to the genealogy, connecting Jesus to David and Abraham, and then explains the birth of Jesus. Luke goes back even before that and explains the announcement of the conception of Jesus and of John the Baptist. And then John even goes back before that, connects it all the way back to the beginning of time, with Genesis 1:1, and connects Jesus with the beginning of the pre-incarnate beginning of creation. And all of them also go farther in time after the resurrection at the end. So I think you can see, Mark has the least stuff in it, and it gets kind of added to with each of the preceding gospel, which is another sign that it was the first, at least in terms of being written, of the events. And also, but oddly enough, Mark is also often the most detailed in terms of the events that are recorded. Mark is frequently the most detailed, which again kind of indicates that it was spoken more by a direct eyewitness. Because there's, far more emphasis is put on the actions and the emotions and the sensory details than we see in the other. And again, Peter, being a man of action himself, just that may have spoken to him. Like that may have been something that appealed to Peter in a way that it didn't appeal to Matthew. Matthew was also an eyewitness. He was present for many of the same events that Peter was, although maybe not quite as many because he wasn't in the inner circle like Peter was. But he may have been just more of an intellectual who appreciated the teachings of Jesus, and Peter may have been a man of action who appreciated the movements and doing and authority of Jesus. So we're going to start with Mark, then we'll do Matthew, then we'll do Luke, then we'll do John. And then after that, we will read them all again, and this time we'll be reading it in chronological sequence of the order in which the events happen, at least as best as we can determine. The Gospels are important. So if you're going to read any part of the Scriptures more than once, it should be this part. Because without the Gospels, there's no reason to bother with any of this. The Gospels are the entire reason why any of this matters, so if you don't read the Gospels, then there's no reason to bother the Old Testament, there's no reason to pay attention to the rest of the New Testament. So if you're going to focus on any of it more than once, if you're going to do any of it more than once, it's going to be this part. And we'll start that tomorrow. My throat is done for the day.